Greetings. It is the 15th of February, 2024. This is Content Evolution New World. Kevin Clark here in Chapel Hill, and my co-host Mike McGuire. Mike is out on the West Coast in Silicon Valley. How's the world treating you, Mike?
Real well this morning. Not raining, so it's good.
Outstanding. Okay, we have a interesting topic. Glad you could join us. I'm going to give you a little caveat in front of what we're about to talk about, which is, when you should think about or hire a consulting firm. Is let's try not to defame a company, right? While you might have had a very specific experience, I would stay generic. If you have something, this is kind of like what my dad told me, praise in public and criticize in private. All right. So if you've got something nice to say, go for it. Right. If it isn't, then I would ask that you, mask, you can talk about what you experience, but mask the company. And with those ground rules, Mike, we incubated this earlier in the week because we were observing a lot of changes that are happening in the world of consulting, and it's actually being both augmented and disrupted by what we're seeing with generative AI. All right, that's beginning.
Right.
If you say, "Gee, it's knowledge management," oh, guess what? That's the business that these firms are in. Right, advisory firms, consulting firms. There's a lot of potential change that could happen. So we thought this would be a really good conversation to have. You came out of that industry, and I've been in it as a federated company for now 15 years.
Right.
So let's what's your perspective, and then we're going to open it up for a broader discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that is noted that you and I noticed is there had been a number of news articles that have seemed to increase in the last few years about some issues, challenges internally, and their relationship, particularly with government entities where they had longstanding contracts, and the notion that they became, started out as becoming kind of indispensable tools or ways to approach problems at large enterprises, which is all well and good. And I think the challenge with, as you just say, with AI is there was always a black box at a lot of these firms, was their process, their methodology. Oftentimes, many of those, the ones like the entities I'd worked with and for, were more focused on research that you would then tune to, a particular company's set of challenges. And there's the notion where I'm paying for expertise on an ongoing basis, and then there's the level where I'm looking for the research that kind of underpins their particular approach at a management company. I was much more focused on the, on the research side as opposed to the relationship side. And I think that's where it gets interesting, right? Is when, particularly one of the things you and I noted is how in our discussions we've seen, what we're meant to be, or initially meant to be, bringing in a firm for a specific project, right? A rebrand, or finding, ways to streamline their supply chains, et cetera, how they purchase technology, to a kind of an ongoing, as it's kind of an ongoing relationship. And I think where we're seeing issues is so much of that black box or big capabilities that these firms have built up in their methodologies over decades are now a fairly, not trivial, but I can now kind of suss out with a chat GPT. I can come up with, give me 5 scenarios for my $2 billion company that needs to reduce cost by 10% across things. It may not be perfect, but as many of us have found, that first response depending on your prompt, gets pretty close. Then it becomes implementation. And I think that's what I see so much of the issue is. There's the investigative work that a company will do. They'll bring in the large teams, really examine a lot of the processes, the costs, etc. And then it becomes like they become a, yet another part of kind of built into the company to do not just the strategic work, but the implementation as well, controlling, which SIs I work with in which regions, which, puts them in a very powerful position that I think oftentimes the companies who brought them in don't know when to say enough is enough.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's where we kind of left it, I think, in our.
And yeah, there's,
work.
there's a notion of reporting that, some of the things that, those firms are doing hollows out the company in certain areas of expertise, right? Because they eventually don't have the capacity to do it. More importantly is that you get down to the point where nobody knows and has enough expertise to know what they're buying, right? And that becomes, that's where there's a degree of criticality where, there are, fundamental issues associated with, right? Can you assess whether what you're getting is actually, good, valuable, doing what you want to do? I'll just say that, in the work that, and in the selection process for bringing people into the Content Evolution Federation, it was always on the basis of, could you, establish relationships that, allowed the clients that we work with to be well, right, as opposed to getting sick as a result of working with us, kind of a health, metric, and transferring skills so that they could increasingly do some of the work themselves, right, as opposed to creating dependency. I think there are appropriate times, like the Boston Consulting Group's core competency analysis, where you make the determination that this isn't core to what we do, so we're going to buy it from others, right? And so there are skill sets. I don't know how many of you would remember this, but in the early days of my career at IBM, we had a golf pro. We had, executive chefs. We had photographers. We had graphic artists, right? None of these people had a career path, right? Because you came in to do a particular task and that was it, right? You weren't going anyplace, right?
Hey, Kevin,
Yeah.
I should point out you're a golf pro on the seventh hole of Pebble Beach. I had closest to the pin. I was within less than a foot.
Yeah.
She came up behind me and beat me. So she was good at her job.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Not with a golf club, I assume. Like Tiger's wife.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No. I couldn't.
There's
I was
no-
so pissed. It was the first time in my life I was going to get closest to the pin, and she beat me.
Yeah.
We can't make fun of companies, but we can make fun of golf pros, can't we? I mean, come on.
Eventually, I think that was there was one on the West Coast, there was one up in Poughkeepsie, there was one at Sands Point out on Long Island, right? There were these country clubs. They don't exist anymore, right? They haven't existed for some time. In any event.
And why were they brought, before you leave this topic, why did IBM bring in golf pros?
Well, because we had, certain types of amenities that we decided that we wanted our employees to have, right? So there were IBM country clubs, right?
Okay.
And those country clubs were near, large populations of, IBMers. But at the same time, you eventually come to some conclusions, like the artists, right? Were needed at a time when we were creating, all the way that we communicated with clients and with each other was something called flip charts. Okay. And so you had to, create things on large pieces of paper that could be, turned over. That eventually became overhead projection foils. That became slides. Then it became PowerPoint. It was a progression of technologies, right? All moving from point A to point B, today a lot of people in corporations they are their own graphic artists because of a number of charts they create every year. So anyway, going back to, core is, delivering capacity, making the organization better, outsourcing, and making the organization dependent. And,
Right.
I think that the dependency and the hollowing out issues are, problematic and are the ones that you see reported, in the news. So let's, open ourselves up. We have some less frequent faces with us today. Robert Heinzman raised his hand. Hello, Robert. We're glad to have you with us from Growth River. You're on mute, sir, if you're trying to say anything.
Yes. Good to see you, Kevin. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. And Rob O'Regan is here. Rob, you are in transition right now, or have you transitioned?
Yes, but we need to clarify the use of transition these days.
Yeah, well,
so.
yeah, I know that could be
I wasn't going to say anything.
You
I
are
wasn't going to say anything.
professional membrane, all right?
Yes, I recently left Foundry, formerly IDG Communications, after a 9-year run there, and now am going back into the consulting world for my little boutique content marketing agency. So that's the transition that Kevin referenced there.
Well, so it is time for us to have lunch again, right? So
yes,
we'll make
absolutely.
that happen, very soon. The weather is getting favorable for us to do that here in the Triangle region. So,
absolutely.
Do you have any thoughts? Being a recent person in the industry, going into a more boutique and or personal practice. What is your sense? All right, we have a lot of people who are like Tim Beharon is here. He is a old hand at delivering a lot of value to clients as an advisory services provider. But Rob, what's your perspective?
Yeah, the perspective I was going to add, Kevin, was from the recent time I was at Foundry, where we had brought in a lot of consultants to help with a lot of the transformational issues that we were going through. We had done a series of acquisitions. We were pivoting from a traditional media company to be more of a data and MarTech company. So, we're owned by private equity now, so they're all about consultants, right? So the issue I had with the consultants that we were bringing in was that the discovery that they did really didn't go deep enough into the organization to really understand kind of how people worked, what they did on a daily basis, right? They were having these conversations at a leadership level, and let's be frank, the leadership team doesn't really know how the day-to-day stuff works. So,
right.
So again, if you're looking at that in the context of Gen AI is not necessarily going to solve that problem, because a lot of it is that institutional knowledge that people carry around in their heads. It's not in a database anywhere in terms of how I do my job every day, right? So that's a problem both for how some existing consultancies work, and a gap in terms of applying Gen AI as a possible solution to that, right? It's not extracting things out of people's brains. There still needs to be some discovery process that involves a conversation between two people. So that was some of the frustrations I had with the way that they were deploying the consultants within Foundry to make suggestions in terms of how we should be integrating the operations better, changes we should be making, where we should be investing, where we should be moving resources away from, those types of things. So that was the initial thought that popped into my head as you queued up the topic today, Kevin.
Rob, that's an excellent point you made, because I thought it was a conversation. I thought it was one of our calls last year, Thursday calls, where we noted, I don't think it was one of the consulting firms. I thought it was Hitachi, or was it another company that hadn't, I don't think, brought a consulting firm in, but the big effort was, to your point, Rob, they were going to go around and make a study and interview all of the employees over a certain age, not because they were old, but because they had lots of experience at the company.
Yep.
to transfer some of that knowledge, as you said, that's been in their heads. And I think, as I recall, I have to go find that, but I seem to think, wow, I wonder why one of the consulting companies didn't come up with this idea, because it sounds like that kind of a project.
Yep.
That, as you say, I've had, did my stint in one of those, and that, to your point, we were often given, reams of presentations by senior management, but there was never an ops person or oh, well, what about the director of that product set? Could we, oh no, here's what you need to know about that unit and that product and how it's doing.
Yeah.
And that would be, it was like, as right, as an old reporter, it's like the last place you want to get information out of is a bunch of managers at a meeting, right? You wait till it's broken up, and then you pick them off one at a time in the parking lot or at the bar or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think that's a challenge when you have these. It's a great set of processes and methodologies these firms will have, but if to your point, it can be very at one level only, right? And never looks too far back, right? Like 3 years, like, well, maybe what happened back here, because this changed and then everything else went to hell. And
and that's where the disconnect is between the recommendation and the execution piece, right? Where, okay, you've made all these recommendations to us, we've signed off on A, B, and C, let's execute now. But now that we're presenting it to the people that are responsible for executing on those changes, they haven't been involved in any of this, and they're like, what the hell are you talking about? That's got nothing to do with the way I do my work right now. So that's where the disconnect is.
All right, very good.
And pricing.
Tim, and any perspective you want to share? Like I mentioned a moment ago, you're an old hand at delivering value to clients. What do you think?
Well, my role was a little bit different because I was an insider. I understood the industry. I had major connections across every major company. I grew up, as you know, I joined IBM as a consultant in '81. So I had a lot of connections there. I had a lot of connections. I worked with Michael Dell when he first started. So I was usually brought in not only to help them think through strategy, but also to possibly make connections. And I remember making a lot of major connections that ended up actually influencing the industry. But I will tell you that I also worked with a lot of outside consultants as a result of that. I became part of the internal team that had to work with the outside consultants. And I want to bring up one particular job title in the consultancy that I consider quite important. And if they didn't get this right, it screwed up the program all across the board. But it was the individual who was the product man, the coordinator, the individual within the consultancy had the role of making it happen and making the connections between the right people. And if you didn't have a project manager who really understood both the company he was working with and his own people, they really were not going to be that successful.
Right.
And I found that in those, and I did a lot of these, that was one of the biggest blocking issues. Whereas, and I remember doing one that had a really big organization, and the individual who was the project manager was fairly new to the company. And it did not go well because they didn't even understand enough about their company, let alone the new company that they were working with. So my only point was, again, my experience is very different because I was brought in as an insider. And yes, I did consult and I put deals together, but it was more focused on, I became a part of the internal team.
Sure.
Right. But I will say that role of project manager, who actually is the inner go between the company and the consultancy, they don't get that one right. I don't see how the project actually goes well. And like I said, in the cases of the ones that did go well, they had a project manager who not only knew their people, but took all the steps necessary to understand the company they were working with. And those dynamics are so important to a successful project.
Yeah. Do you
I knew one of those
have you
people,
ever,
Tim. Go ahead. Sorry, you go.
I was gonna say, Tim, have you run into people that you are aware have certifications like, Product Development Management Association, PDMA certifications in project management? Do you find that those certifications actually are hallmarks of people who, grok it better? Or do you think that there's something that's just innate in, selecting the right person who has the right personality?
To be honest with you, a little bit of both. I mean, if they
Okay.
have the actual training and understand the process from a true training standpoint, I should say not training, but understand the discipline that goes into project management. And I have to admit that there's one other element that's hard to quantify, but it's the personality
Oh
of the
yeah.
project manager.
Exactly right.
Because if the project manager is dictatorial by nature, it doesn't go quite as well.
Absolutely.
But having said that, I find that I found in a lot of those cases, the more experience they had in that role for their company,
Yep.
and the amount of understanding and actually their own contacts inside their own company is what actually made it more successful.
Well, I learned early on that because I knew a woman who's retired now, but she was one of those coordinators, Tim, and she would refer to me and analysts like me as show dogs. It's like, you're the show dog. You come in for this thing in the mobile, then we're going to bring the best of breed for data analytics. And I said, well, that makes you what? Our manager. And she said, you can call me that. But what she was she said, it was long before people were using this to describe themselves. She said, I'm the solution. I deliver the solution. You're the show dog who provides the content. I deliver the solution. And this wasn't the person who would get up and do the presentation at the end, the grand report. She was the manager. I mean, that was probably the most generic way you could describe what she did. But she had all the attributes you talked about, Tim. She knew the connections. She may not, have a chemical engineer, be a chemical engineer, and we were working with a chemical engineering company. She knew enough where to find the right expertise, and more importantly, bring the expert in and make them understand how they had to deliver that information, the research they were working on. And that particular person was one of those very influential people in my lives, because she made me understand, as cool as whatever research the team I was working on was, how cool that was, if it didn't specifically impact the clients at that point, the client's ability to improve, it was dross. She had a different word for that. And I'm trying to, Mark and I are both trying to clean up our language on these calls.
Yeah.
So I'll just say dross.
Yeah. I would just add that I had an experience that some of you are aware of, where Heidi was in the hospital a couple of years ago. And, the team member that I was unaware of until we got there was the health coordinator, right? And her health coordinator, in addition to the nurse, I had done some research on trying to model and do simulations, for health environments, and, came to, the conclusion in doing some interviews that the nursing staff provides the health environment and the doctors provide interventional procedures. That they're intermittent, okay, in terms of their contact with the patients, because they have a specialty, and it's across a broad number of patients, and but the nurse is there, with you, or nursing staff, 24/7, right, and have the most contact. And the health coordinator is the person that actually understands everything coming in, all of the billing stuff, all right, making sure that, as you're transitioning, that if you need rehab that you're moving from the hospital into a facility that can provide those services and that it's seamless. That is, it became kind of like, wow, this is a really critical person. I'm going to make friends with her. But it wasn't, it wasn't apparent to me that that was one of the people that I needed to know until we got there. And maybe that's not the case for if the hospital gets small, but for a large hospital, this is an important role. Mac, I have a question for you.
Yes, sir.
You bought a lot of services from consulting, advisory, service providing firms, in your role when you were running market research and intelligence insights at Bank of America Merrill Lynch. So you were the buyer, right? What was the gradient where you felt like you needed to have people on staff versus those things that you wanted to buy externally, right? And did that gradient change over time? Because you were there for how many years?
A long time.
Long time, multiple decades, right?
Yes. And I think of consultants, and this is a roundabout way to get to your answer. I think of consultants in different levels. So I've had experience with all of the major McKinsey's, Bain's, BCG's, and I've had experience with all of the accounting firms' consulting components. And the majority of the things I was buying was research capability. And that research capability was frequently a function of, did I just have the capability, the capacity to do it? So I may have had 60 analysts, but those 60 analysts were working 12-hour days. And there were times that someone needed to go deep on a subject or had expertise. For example, sometime around 2006, maybe, I needed to understand how American banks were perceived in 20 other countries.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the majority of the team did not have the time to go deep into how to structure, how to manage all of the legal issues, all of the just getting it doneness.
Mm-hmm.
So I brought in a general contractor, which tended to be one of the world's largest research firms, to play general contractor. There was, as Tim was describing, an engagement manager. That engagement manager wasn't the senior partner, but you partnered with the engagement manager to do what you needed to do to make sure they were able to do for you what you needed.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's really different, though, Kevin, from bringing in the top 3 or 4 consulting firms, which usually had a very specific agenda. And sometimes that agenda succeeded or failed based on whether they were arriving with an open mind, open to any solution, or whether they were arriving with a solution that the consulting engagement was meant to confirm. So a lot of different variation on that space, but I bought for capacity. And early on, we did not have some of the modelers, excuse me, the modelers on staff that we needed. So we would bring in modeling capability. That changed over time as we brought in more people with that modeling capability. But there are also extremely rare people, like, say, Bill Dillon at MAPS, who just weren't able to do the modeling. They were inventing the modeling as they went.
Right.
And since we wanted to stay on the leading edge, we frequently brought in new thinkers who could give us that differentiating innovation advantage.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing that. And I think that your the capabilities of the team clearly did change, over time. And I think that you in those early conversations that we were having when you were still there, all right, who you were serving, how the organization was, structured, changed, and that would cause you to remix your skill set too, right?
Yeah.
Depending on whether you were aligned with business units or whether you were centralized or, all those other kinds of good things.
Right.
So conditions, changed, and, you adapt accordingly to how what the business needs. Fortunately, you were a good C-suite advisor, buddy. So
I tried.
good for
I
you.
tried.
Robert, you've been listening for a moment now. We're half an hour into our conversation. We're glad to have you with us. Your thoughts?
Well, it's interesting. The program management, in my shop, we call it account management. And it gets back to that golf issue that we discussed earlier.
Sure.
Because what we work on is we work on change management, but from the leadership perspective. So the essential elements in our work are get to know all the executive assistants really well.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And have really good relationships with them. Know the names of their children.
Mhm.
Because organizations change based on conversation, not on technical aptitude. Not in the first instant. They change on conversations. They're social systems, not machines. So account management or program management, it's essential. You've got to know the people. You've got to know who does what. You have to understand the relationships. And in the big organizations I've worked in, you've got to understand the politics, because you got to understand the power dynamics of people at the top, because the people who make the most money oftentimes are the people who want to make more money and control turf.
Yeah.
And the human condition is in full form. So in my experience, all that has to be navigated as the foundation upon which you build any house or create any value.
Yeah. I remember.
And I have been on the wrong side of that equation.
Okay.
So I've got the scar tissue.
Well, it doesn't show, all right, wherever it is, it's not showing at the moment, but I get that. I mean,
I just want to say,
Yeah,
Kevin, executive sponsorship is critical.
Oh, yeah.
Executive sponsorship is absolutely critical. If you don't have that, because I will never know what you do in your company to the degree that I can go in and move all the knobs and levers. That's not my job.
Sure.
My job is to create the clearings for you all, because you have the expertise to figure it out together. In the you all being the whoever it is, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, depending on the job and the challenge, the challenge statement that you're working on resolving. But executive sponsorship, without that, there's no gas in the tank.
Yeah. And there can be a difference between an executive sponsor and the person who has actually retained you to do the work.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
And
absolutely.
So the fact is, you go back to politics, right? Yes, right. These are complex organisms, right? And while all the blood supply and all that kind of stuff is coming from the person who wrote the purchase order, right, and is ultimately responsible for the work, right? Somebody else is playing the role of liver and kidneys, right, and getting the the detritus out of the way, right, and making it possible for you to have an environment that's healthy enough to and to make the connections, because sometimes the person who's paying the bill isn't the best connected person, right, to create effectiveness. What I was going to say earlier about executive assistants is I'm old enough that it used to be secretaries, okay, and making friends.
We're all old enough.
Yeah, the secretaries were the ones that you had to make friends with, because otherwise you couldn't get an appointment, right? So if you made friends with the person who is sitting outside the door, then we used to talk about the fact that if there was a person inside the executive's office who was relational and was likely to be a more accessible person, the secretarial administration staff would pair that person with someone who was a sergeant secretary, right? And was very, would kind of, keep people out, okay, that were going to cause trouble, and vice versa, that if the person inside, that every time you went in, that there was wounded coming out of the office, right, that you needed to have a triage nurse, okay, as a secretary, all right, who would, make amends, all right, both, going in and coming out. So it's interesting that those dynamics were actively thought about at the time.
Rob,
Jürgen, just
right.
one point that I want to throw in is that I think we all know that the moment that golf pro knows there's a management consultant sniffing around, the first call they make is to their best buddy EVP that they play golf with to wonder what's going on. And then the EVP calls the person who hired the consulting firm and said, yeah, this person's important to closing X amount of revenue. Right. And so you get the politics that that happen in a large organization when the employees find out that a management firm is coming in. And just, one other point is that I think that the majority of large companies recognize now that management consultants and often is a code word for outsourcing, and it's also understood that they're not going to come in and say everything's running smoothly. That changes will be coming, and so you run into, as Robert was saying, this political barrier of people either protecting their turf or trying to go after some new turf, or perhaps not not being as forthcoming as they might be with them. And having come from that world, one of the things that is happening out there is the rise of these boutique type of firms, whether it's Mike in your world of the Gartners, right, where you can have a much smaller firm with less overhead that you can work with, or if it's a digital product that you're looking for, they don't want a year-long sales cycle to engage with a firm. They just want that, they want a tactical team to come in with the right level of people to do the research and develop the product and be gone in 3 months after they have a minimal viable product ready to go. They don't want these consultants hanging around because these contracts can be massive.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, we had entire programs where, when I was working for a PC company at IBM, where, we had a particular thing that we wanted to make, and we said, well, guess what? We're not going to make it, right? We're going to send that over to another company, and we're going to OEM it. Okay, so it's someone else is going to take our development process and pick it up from the research point and make it real, right? And we're to turn it over to company X to manage that. At the end of the program, right, when we say, okay, no more quantities, then they either had something else that was coming up, or that was the end of the program. That's how selling that business to Lenovo, that's one of the ways that they made margin, is they took those OEMs out of the picture because they were the manufacturer, and you say, we developed it, we're making it, the middle person's out, and we can capture that margin. So different.
Well, increasingly though, the products are digital, right? Increasingly it's a digital product, and it's time to market is the big thing. And unless one of these giant firms is incredibly agile, and if you go on all their websites, they will claim that they are, right, that they can that they can turn on a dime, right? Go to all of those major consulting firms' websites, and it's the first thing you'll see is how agile they are in turning a product around or whatever. Again, it'll be 9 months before the first person lands and is starting to work on the project.
Robert was shaking his head. I think it might be more along the lines of how agile they claim. Robert, why were you shaking your head?
I was just saying that I agree. I was agreeing because I appreciate scale. I think it's necessary, but there are trade-offs, and agility is one of them.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, and
Yep.
in fact, almost without exception.
Yeah.
It's like natural law.
Yeah, it's also that, you know, and this is a, you know, well-known secret, right? Is a lot of the larger consulting firms that have a relationship all the way up to the board level, what they're contracted to do and what's on the purchase order, there's a whole bunch, you know, this is like the $700 hammer, right, being bought, right? Is kind of like, does it really cost that much? No, because there are things that we're asking the firm to do that we don't want anybody actually that's tactically doing stuff in the organization to know about, right? So we're going to pay you this much money. On the face of it, it's for this, but it's actually for all these other things that we're not going to tell you about, right? That the senior management team wants advice and counsel about, or you know, once performed, right? But you know, to the purchasing agent, it's invisible, right? So there's a little kabuki dance, you know, going on there that is just part of, you know, doing that, you know, being in that world and doing that work. I think it's also well known that anytime you get to the edge of thinking that you need to pick your metaphorical language, right size, downsize, rescale, blah, 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 is you would like somebody else to make a recommendation to the board of directors that would be a good idea to do, so that they can point to that recommendation and rubber stamp it, as opposed to it actually coming out directly out of one of their committees. So
It's less risk for them, right?
well,
You know,
it's de-risking the environment.
absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, that's
You know, it's funny. It's funny, a little bit off topic, but CBS, which had the Super Bowl on Sunday, the largest TV event since the moon landing, just a incredible success on Sunday. They come out of that on Monday and announce layoffs.
Yeah.
You know, and again, this is a classic example of, you know, is the day after the biggest rating event in our company's history, the time when we should be, you know, having layoffs and suck the news cycle away and turn it into a story about job cuts, right? So you have these competing interests in the companies, and I'm sure the plan for the layoffs, whether it involved consultants or not, was put into place long ago, part of some whatever plan happened, and it just ends up damaging the story or the brand, if you will. You know, so again, I think that you know, a lot of the boards and C-suite are just looking to be able to point somewhere else and say, well, you know, it wasn't me that cut, you know, this number of jobs. It was a recommendation that the company just needed to tighten its belt. We needed to, you know, focus on other areas or whatever it may be.
okay.
I wanted to underscore something that Robert said, that, you know, I've experienced a great deal in my own work, but the idea of specifically developing a relationship with the administrative assistant to the EVP, I can't underscore that enough. Because in the end, as a project manager, you really need to, and I'm going through this particular one with a major insurance company right now, is I'm dealing with a woman who reports directly to an EVP. And we've spent months getting really to know her. And it's greased the skids to be able to get to the next level up on a more consistent basis. And Robert's really right there, that as a part of the process. And that's why I bring up the issue of the project manager personality to some degree. You know, they have to, in a lot of cases, besides being firm managers and directors, their personality plays a great role in the success, I think, of the project.
No question about it. out of personal experience, one of the most successful engagements that I've ever participated in, which was shared with Dr. Yamazaki in Japan for Nippon Electric Company, or NEC, which is started off life being kind of like General Electric, right? 25 plus years older than IBM, is we were, trying to create a smaller brand portfolio, because there were a lot of sub names, right, that were out in the marketplace that were standalone, that didn't have enough marketing communication spend for them to actually be effective. But to have that conversation with the business units, we chartered the initiative through the chairman's office. The chairman's office became our champion for this thing. We got the CFO's office to be, the bad cop, right, in terms of hey, a master brand would be a good idea, but if you don't want to move in that direction, then we can, cut off your marketing communications funding, right, through the CFO's office. So there was an encouraging narrative, and then there was the, stuff, and it was all, it was a group of people who we created a committee that sequentially over, multi-year period of time had those conversations. And we got rid of 80% of those unsupported brands, the ones that had a case where they could show that there was equity in something that they had built. We were willing to hear those business cases and, do something different. It was very satisfying because it worked, right? We know master brand strategies, are, highly effective. Whatever they were calling prior to renaming it to NEC Cloud Services, everybody understood NEC Cloud Services a lot better. So, with that said, it was an interesting moment, and that support from, the top of the super tower was, really, really helpful. Mark, we haven't heard from you. You've been smiling the whole time, so I take it you're enjoying the conversation, but you have some perspective to share on our topic.
I will share whatever perspective I have. I've enjoyed this conversation. I learn a lot because so many of you have these deep corporate backgrounds that I don't have. I have the experience of having worked for one of the big consulting companies. And I guess I would underscore what a number of people have commented about, how this all really does come down to humans and personalities and conversations and relationships. And one of the things that I observed when I was in my company is that I would never go to hire the company because it got the company name, the consulting company. I would go to a specific person. The only thing because if you hired the company and got a random person from that company, it could work or it could not work. And that may be hard to do. It's hard to figure out who's who and who all the officers and managers and all this stuff are. And this has been my experience with consultants that I've hired on the other side as a small business owner. There are some who overpromise and underdeliver, which is in fact most of them. And then there are some who underpromise and unbelievably overdeliver, which are the ones you're really looking for. And they often even charge less. It's amazing. But finding those people is a really hard thing to do, I found. And so if I were in the position, and that some of you have been in, who are the managers needing to get stuff done and all this kind of stuff, it's a tough thing to figure out who to hire. And I was in the point, I come from the era where there was one consulting group that did the Seagull, dropping the report, the Seagull Consulting, and another half of that group dropped out. I'm not mentioning names here, started their own group, and I think they're now bigger because they wanted to implement, and they put their people into the company, full time, dressed better than the other people, and but it all comes down to the people. And if you get the smart people, if you're looking for something where smarts are required, you better get the smart people. And if you're looking for something where relationships are required, you'd better get the good relationship people.
Right.
And they're not always the same people. In fact, often they're not. So I don't know if that adds anything, but that's my perspective.
Yeah, well, it does. I mean, there's an old saw that says that people don't quit companies, they quit managers, right?
Bosses,
and so
yeah.
the inverse is that, people don't hire, consulting companies, they hire, consultants or advisors that they know and trust, for some reason,
Yeah.
through previous exposure or, line of sight to results that they value.
Mhm.
And I think that that's right, Mark. I don't think that there's any question about that. I'll also point out, some of you are aware of, what we do in one of our member companies in Platform UX is that the value proposition of, hey, this isn't working right and we can help you fix it, right, is one of the things that you would, that you might seek out a consultant for. Whereas, the value proposition for what we're doing, which kind of opens some interesting doors, is, we'd like to do the same inventory, but we'd like to understand what you do well, as opposed to what you need improvement for. And if we can identify those things and they're not germane to your core value proposition, that it's simply part of, it's a good business process, we can identify it, we can externalize it, we can turn it into a platform, and it'll be a new revenue stream for you. Would you like to have that conversation? And since that's not reaching into your pocket, but talking about, creating a new revenue stream, at least there are initial opportunities to have differentiated conversations because of that. I would the only reason I say that is, do you have, a different port of entry that allows you to have a conversation, with prospects that don't necessarily have that previous relationship that you're talking about, Mark, to be able to, have an initial conversation and understand why it might be good, right, to do a proof of concept. Because absent of the relationship, the other thing is, they're not going to sign a big contract. They're going to want to do something, that's smaller first, to see whether we're compatible, either from a process standpoint, relationship standpoint, or both.
If I can, I agree. And this brings me back to what I try to do now, and I don't know how many people do it, but it's pay for performance. And the idea of I would never or very rarely hire a consultant or anybody to do something on a pay them by the hour or pay them a contract for this. I'd much rather say, I will pay you a much larger share. I will pay you a share of the revenue that you generate. And so, for example, when I talk about people who want to market books, they say, oh, we can do this for you and we can do this for you. I say, yeah, I love that stuff. I will pay you half of what I get out of this revenue stream. And I think that's a different value proposition that more and more people should be adapting, because then the people who succeed thrive and the people who don't succeed don't thrive as much.
Okay.
I don't know. I've always thought that too, Mark. And I think, at our company, the company that the companies I've worked for, there was, at the time, I think the somewhat of a wall between that notion of us doing some research, custom research for a company, and then getting paid based on the revenue they made. And I think that was probably a legal risk or perception thing of those companies, that they didn't want to be seen as, they want to be seen as independent. right? Not getting paid, but not necessarily benefiting from the revenue of the thing downstream. But I'm now seeing, as you were speaking of, I brought to mind a friend of mine who's developed a lot of stuff for fee for companies to use his platform. He's got another one he's working on with AI that was a job for accountants 20 years ago, which is his system now goes in and looks for the extra hidden fees, right, in merchant accounts for online payment, credit card transactions, etc. And I do remember working at a company, not a consulting company, it was a technology company, where we brought in a financial consultant. The company was getting ready to, in a couple of years, go public, right? So they wanted to make sure they had all their, financial reporting systems up to snuff. And I remember that was a manual job, as in we brought in an accountant, a CPA, and a payroll specialist, and they spent 6 months going through the books. His tool now replaces that. It goes in using AI, open AI tools, and looks for those fees, but he's doing exactly what you say, nothing up front. Just give me a statement that's secure, that you don't worry about. Let me our systems analyze it. We need it like a month's worth or a quarter's worth of invoices and payment history. If I find 50,000 in savings in a month, I get 25. Otherwise, there's literally no cost to the client.
It's what the lawyers call on spec.
On spec, right. And I think, I don't know, but I think, as I said earlier, I think previous things where I worked at, and Robert, go ahead. You're on mute.
You're on mute, sir.
Somebody knocked on the door.
Oh,
okay.
And
right.
I just want, if that's, hey, get it out. Jesus.
Oh, that's my, you have dogs too.
The dogs, can you hear them? They're like, we have a.
Not really. It's not
taking care of a dog right now has a very big voice.
It's
That's
lunchtime.
a very interesting comment that you just made, though, and I want to pick up on it. I know we've got to end, but that you can do things on spec because your cost of operation has avalanched off a cliff because you can deploy AI-enabled tools.
Yeah.
The cost, like I write narratives. That's one of the things I write: leadership change narratives. How do I take care of all the anti-change antibodies? How do I align stakeholders? How do I get my team on board? And writing a narrative, that could take a few days of interviews and writing, and now I can do it in about 30 minutes.
And the other requirement for some of it, if you're talking about, if you're lowering cost and it's in a finite part of the business, that's pretty measurable. You can look at the KPI. If it's something that is causing, more revenue to get generated across a, broad swath of the business, what it requires is access to your books, right? And in a lot of cases, the business is not interested in showing you their accounting, right? And so there's a lot of trust involved in saying, okay, we're delivering an upside, all right? Show us how much more revenue. We don't want to do that. So, that can be problematic.
And it's always been the advertising problem. How do you connect advertising to revenue?
Right.
Directly.
You don't know which 50% is wasted, right? As
we still don't know which 50%. We still don't know which 50%.
We have no idea, right?
Yeah.
You're wasting 50% of your spend. We just don't know which 50%.
And we thought online and digital was going to change all that, where we'd be able to have that very specific revenue increase as a result of the.
Thank you.
So is the same
Thanks, Robert.
thing where you're wasting 50% of your consulting spend? We just don't know which half. Is that what's happening?
Maybe. And
the Wanamaker query or concern. I think that was his name.
But in any event, I think we have reached the angle of repose for this particular conversation. So thank you very much for joining today, and in everything you do, be intentional, and we appreciate it. We'll talk to you next week. I want to just remind you that we have Jemay Cassio with us, who is a futurist, cultural anthropologist, and he's going to be talking about BANI, all right? And if you don't know what it is, look it up. Look at the Wikipedia, BANI. It is a kissing cousin to VUCA, right? Volatile, uncertain. and all that kind of good stuff. So it's going to be worth your time investment to be with us when Jemay is with us.
Not
All right,
any-
thanks,
Means you'll
Kevin.
be intentional. Cheers.
Good. Thanks, everybody. Bye.